Greetings, fellow cultivators. Welcome to Autonova. Remember to like and subscribe to support the journey. Now, let's dive into the next chapter of A Will Eternal. Or perhaps the truth was slightly different. Upon seeing Du Lingfei, Bai Xiaochun smiled bitterly and was fairly certain that he understood. Many years ago, the Celestial rebelled, waging war against the entire Arch-Emperor dynasty. The forces of the Arch-Emperor were soundly defeated, losing not just the lands of Heavenspan, but also one of their most important legacies, the Live Forever Codex from the Undying Live Forever technique. After relocating to the Wildlands, the Arch-Emperor dynasty only had the Undying Codex. Perhaps in an attempt to resist the Celestial, or perhaps just to foster hope, the Gravekeeper had taken steps to allow people who were not direct descendants of the Arch-Emperor to cultivate the Undying Codex. And as the technique became more widespread, incomplete copies eventually showed up in sects in the lands of Heavenspan. As a result, the Undying Codex lived on. At the same time, everyone in the Heavenspan realm had a chance to cultivate a secret magic that had once belonged only to the Arch-Emperor. The Celestial didn't do anything to stop it, focused as he was on the Live Forever Codex. However, it was only after attempting to actually cultivate the Live Forever Codex, and failing, that he came up with an idea that could only be described as insane. He would encourage more and more people to cultivate both the Undying Codex and the Live Forever Codex. Then he would fuse those people together and use them to concoct an Undying Live Forever pill. By consuming that pill, he would then get access to the hidden power offered by the Undying Live Forever technique. Both the bones scattered in the necropolis, and the remains of the 3 Arch-Emperors, had all been used in his extensive research. Unfortunately for him, the Live Forever Codex was much more difficult to cultivate than the Undying Codex, and also more powerful. Despite all the years which had passed, none of the countless cultivators who had cultivated it had ever succeeded. At most, some of them made superficial progress. But then his top apprentice came along. She was the frigid matriarch of the north, and once she mastered the Live Forever Codex, the Celestial's heart began to burn with avarice. It was at around that time that a mighty hero rose up in the Wildlands, a person called the Blood Ancestor. Perhaps it was his own spectacular talent, or perhaps he had the blood of the Arch-Emperors in him. Either way, he mastered the Undying Codex, and made a spectacular breakthrough, reaching the fleshly body level of a demigod. If it wasn't for the fact that the Celestial had brought ruin to the Arch-Emperor dynasty, it was entirely possible that the Blood Ancestor would have eventually gone on to cultivate the Live Forever Codex. If the Blood Ancestor had succeeded with both codices, then he would have been able to break through to the Celestial realm. He would have met the qualifications enforced by the Gravekeeper to leave the Heavenspan realm. The frigid matriarch should have been the Blood Ancestor's greatest enemy. But somehow, they fell in love with each other. And when they discovered the truth of the Celestial's schemes, well, Bai Xiaochun had already been told that story by the frigid matriarch herself. The frigid matriarch betrayed her master, and joined with the Blood Ancestor to try to kill him. In the end, the Blood Ancestor died, and sank to the bottom of the Heavenspan River, with only one defiant hand stretching out above the surface of the water. The frigid matriarch also perished. However, she managed to create a soul clone that possessed a true spirit. Afterward, she remained hidden in the Spirit Stream sect, forever gazing into the distance at the Blood Ancestor, her Taoist partner. Because of how things played out, the Celestial's first chance to concoct the pill he desired ended in a failure. But the Celestial didn't give up. In the years that passed, he tried to come up with other ways to escape the world in which he was trapped. But at the same time, he kept the Undying Live Forever pill in his back pocket, ready to use as a last resort. If no one else came along who could master the Live Forever Codex, then perhaps the Celestial would have been forced to eventually abandon his insane plan. But then, his daughter, Du Lingfei, became the second person who was able to cultivate the technique. Du Lingfei's bones slowly became crystal. And although she didn't advance by leaps and bounds like Bai Xiaochun had done with the Undying Codex, her rapid advancement in her cultivation proved that she wasn't very far behind him. After all, she had the backing of the Celestial, and therefore, it was only natural that her cultivation would go easier than it would for others. The Celestial was not completely cold-hearted when it came to the fact that his daughter was succeeding with the Live Forever Codex. On the one hand, he deeply desired to escape the Heavenspan realm. But on the other hand, he still hesitated at the thought of sacrificing his own child. It was that hesitation which led to the spectacular battle in the Wildlands, and his alliance with Ghost Mother's soul clone. All of it had been an attempt to either kill the Gravekeeper or escape to the world beyond by using Ghost Mother's battleship. Unfortunately for him, all of his plans had failed. The Celestial began to descend into utter madness, and at the same time, constantly muttered, "Gravekeeper, you bastard, you're forcing me to do all of this." As far as the Celestial was concerned, the Gravekeeper really was forcing him down this path. It wasn't what he truly wanted, but he felt that he had no other choice. And thus, he had gone to war with the Wildlands. He would end all life in the Wildlands, kill the Gravekeeper, dispel the Underworld River, and end the bloodline of the Arch-Emperor dynasty. In the middle of all that, Bai Xiaochun became the next person after the Blood Ancestor to master the Undying Codex. In the end, the Celestial had two choices: sacrifice his own flesh and blood, or watch his longevity run out, and his hopes of escaping the Heavenspan realm be dashed to pieces. Finally, he picked the former. And considering how his initial attempt at this plan had failed, as soon as he made his decision, he placed a magical slave seal on Du Lingfei. Then he simply waited for Bai Xiaochun to show up. After confirming that Bai Xiaochun had succeeded with the Undying Codex, he made his move. There was no one to stand in his way, and thus, he brought Bai Xiaochun from the Wildlands to Heavenspan Island. Bai Xiaochun watched bitterly as Du Lingfei stepped out from behind the Celestial. Her expression was vacant, making her seem almost like a marionette or puppet. Furthermore, deep within her eyes, it was just possible to see the flickering slave seals. "Boo," he said, thinking back to how the Celestial had used the both of them to lure out the ghost face. He would never forget the disappointment and bitterness he had seen in her expression back then. "Don't hate me," the Celestial said. "I never wanted to do this. It's all the fault of the Gravekeeper." Suddenly, he threw his head back and laughed uproariously, although it was possible to detect bitter sadness within the laughter, as well as madness. The Celestial had truly gone crazy. It was visible in his eyes, as well as his smile, which looked completely different than it had in the past. Eyes bloodshot, he performed a right-handed incantation gesture and then pointed at Du Lingfei. In response, Du Lingfei shivered and looked up slowly. Expression blank, she began to walk slowly toward Bai Xiaochun, who could do nothing other than watch her approach. When she stepped into the blood in the pool, it immediately stained her white garments black. At the same time, the greedy magical symbols began to crawl onto her and pass to and fro on her skin. She stopped right in front of him, where she slowly reached out, and put her hand on top of his head. As she did, she began to glow with crystalline light. At that point, the aura of the Live Forever Codex erupted out. Chuckling endlessly, the Celestial shoved his right hand down onto the ground, causing the entire necropolis to tremble. The spell formation began to radiate dazzling light, and the bones which formed it melted. Even the remains of the three Arch-Emperors started melting away. The melting of the bones caused the spell formation to glow even brighter. At the same time, the black blood began to bubble and seethe, sending more magical symbols wriggling onto Bai Xiaochun and Du Lingfei. They began to pour into their eyes, ears, noses and mouths. The pain caused Bai Xiaochun to shiver, but what was worse was the anguish and rage he felt. His anguish was because of what was happening to Du Lingfei, and his rage was because of the cruelty of the Celestial. "Am I going to die?" he thought. Again, he tried to call out to the frigid matriarch, but there was no response. Magical symbols rushed into him, causing him to glow with golden light that seemed to correlate perfectly to the crystalline glow coming off of Du Lingfei. A resonance formed with the light of the spell formation, whereupon a shocking gravitational force erupted from Du Lingfei. The gravitational force spread through Du Lingfei and into Bai Xiaochun, causing him to shiver. Looking dully at Du Lingfei, he slowly closed his eyes. However, when that happened, a look of intense struggle appeared in Du Lingfei's eyes. A tremor ran through her, and suddenly she seemed like she might lift her hand off of his head. Apparently, despite the slave seal that had been placed on her, she instinctively refused to harm Bai Xiaochun. The human body was still capable of reacting even under the control of a slave seal. Clearly, Du Lingfei had a tenacious determination in her heart to avoid hurting Bai Xiaochun. When Bai Xiaochun felt the hand on the top of his head trembling, he opened his eyes to see Du Lingfei's face twitching. Furthermore, the magical slave seals in her eyes were flickering dramatically. A moment passed, and then, she moved her hand away. "Boo," he murmured. Off to the side, mixed emotions could be seen in the Celestial's eyes. However, he quickly wiped them away with madness. Reaching his hand out, he pointed at his daughter. She shivered, and the slave seals overwhelmed any sensation of pain she felt. She went still, and then, calmly put her hand back down on Bai Xiaochun's head. She looked at him with eyes that didn't contain even a scrap of emotion, and yet, Bai Xiaochun could still sense her inner pain. His lips parted as if he were about to say something, but instead, he stayed silent. This time, he didn't close his eyes. He knew that his life was nearing its end, and therefore, in that final moment before he died, he would create an eternal memory of what he was seeing. Rumbling sounds filled the necropolis as the bones melted into the spell formation. Then, an explosive force left Du Lingfei's hand and entered Bai Xiaochun's head. Intense pain raged through him as his life force, cultivation base, flesh, blood, and soul all began to rush toward Du Lingfei. It was as if his body were being destroyed. His bones, blood, energy passageways, and everything else that made him up were being transformed into the ultimate type of life force. That life force was what the Celestial needed, and what was currently rushing toward Du Lingfei. Bai Xiaochun was the undying medicine, and Du Lingfei was the pill furnace that could live forever. After that pill furnace sucked in the medicine, it would sacrifice itself, withering up into death to produce an undying live forever pill. Soon, the Celestial muttered. Very soon now. I've been waiting my whole life to get this undying live forever pill. He began chuckling loudly, his expression twisted and distorted in bizarre fashion as he watched his daughter absorbing Bai Xiaochun. Bai Xiaochun was shaking violently, and was racked with unprecedented levels of pain. He had endured much pain to cultivate the undying codex, but none of that could even come close to comparing to what he was feeling now. He was beginning to wither up. His hair was even turning dry and brittle. His undying blood began to fade away, and his undying bones were turning dull and dark. His undying tendons, undying flesh, and undying skin were all melting. He couldn't struggle or fight back. As he was emptied out, as his life force was sucked away, he slowly began to lose consciousness. He suddenly thought back to everything he had done in the wildlands. He thought of Bai Hao, the giant ghost king, Mistress Red Dust, and Zhou Yixing. Then he thought of the river-defying sect. He pictured Li Qinghao, Song Junwan, Master God Diviner, and so many other faces. They seemed so vivid to him that he was sure he could reach out and touch them. The river-defying sect, he murmured in a voice that only he and the dead could hear. As he weakened, his hair began to fall out, transforming into dust before it could even touch the surface of the black blood. By now, he was so withered that he was like a candle flickering on the verge of winking out. He wasn't thinking about the river-defying sect anymore. He was thinking about the eastern lower reaches, and the spirit stream sect. It was as if all the memories of his life were flowing past him. He saw himself in front of the stone stels of plants and vegetation. He saw himself licking his lips as he eyed some spirit tail chickens. He saw himself with big fatty Zhang. He saw his master, who had perished before even taking him as an apprentice. He saw Hu Xiaomei. He saw so many things. By now, he couldn't breathe. He looked like brittle skin wrapped over dry bones. Rotting patches of death were spreading out to cover him, and his teeth began to fall out. As of this moment, he looked like a desiccated corpse that had been left in the grave for years and years. The hand on top of his head was like a black hole sucking away at everything that was him, and filling him with a pain that he had already grown used to. The undying codex was now 80% extracted from him, and it was the same with his life force. In his fading consciousness, he no longer saw the spirit stream sect but instead Mount Hood. On top of the mountain was a boy who was somehow holding 7 or 8 axes and cleavers, all at the same time. At the top of the mountain, he tossed the weapons aside, and even as thunder crashed in the sky, he lit a stick of incense. It was a comical sight that made him want to smile. But he couldn't control his body, and was thus incapable. Perhaps that was a good thing, considering his current appearance. Smiling would have made him look even more horrifying. As his consciousness continued to fade, he was fairly certain he could sense his soul beginning to rise up from inside of him, toward an all-consuming vortex. He only had about 10% of his life force left. Cracks had begun to appear on his dried-up skin, to the point where the slightest brush of a hand would likely turn it into ash. It was the same with his 5 yin organs and 6 yang organs. The power of the undying codex was now almost completely gone. Only a tiny scrap of it remained in his bones, which caused the faintest glimmer of gold to be visible through the ragged openings in his skin. In that moment, he saw what would likely be the last image he ever saw. A child crouched next to a bed, tears streaming down his face. As his parents began to breathe their last breaths, he began to weep, and then to wail. Xiaochun, a weak voice murmured, "Don't be afraid." A cold hand came to rest on his forehead. "Take this stick of incense. Haven't you always dreamed of becoming an immortal? Here, take it." The boy looked up through his tears to take the incense. Then, the hand which had moments ago lifted the incense up to him slowly dropped down. The boy's tears flowed even harder. The boy remained at the bedside in a daze. Eventually, the neighbors came into the room and carried him out. He saw many sympathetic gazes as his parents' bodies were carried away. The boy sat down in a corner, wrapped his arms tightly around his knees, and looked at the incense. Why do people die? I want to live. I want all the people around me to live. I want everyone to be happy. I want to live forever. The boy's voice echoed away into silence inside of Bai Xiaochun's mind, a figment of eternity. He felt more tired than he ever had been in his entire life. However, in that moment right before his consciousness disappeared, a teardrop fell down onto the parched skin of his arm. As it was absorbed into his skin, it seemed to merge into his rapidly devolving consciousness. A teardrop, he murmured. He could sense the bitterness in it. Using his last scrap of energy, he opened his eyes and could just barely make out Du Lingfei, struggling against the slave seal. Even if it destroyed her, she was determined to remove her hand from the top of his head. Oh, so slowly, her hand began to rise up. Then she spoke in a voice laced with the utmost despair. Daddy, I beg you. Although her words were spoken softly, they struck the celestial like lightning. He began to tremble. The celestial's heart felt like it was about to be ripped to pieces. Things which had once been the most important in his life, but had vanished along the way, were suddenly brought right back to the forefront thanks to Du Lingfei's words. He suddenly saw her as a child, tugging at his garments and calling him daddy in her cute, girly voice. He wasn't sure exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the line, she had stopped calling him daddy and started calling him father. Fair, he said, trembling physically, his pupils constricting. After all, this was his daughter, his own flesh and blood. The Celestial was the mighty ruler of the entire world and yet, had never had many Taoist partners. Over all the years, he had never had a son. Du Lingfei was his only daughter and in fact, his only child. The Celestial had been so focused on escaping the Heavenspan realm that Du Lingfei's mother had never meant much to him. She had long since passed away. The Celestial's heart was currently being ripped two ways, in one direction by his humanity and in the other by his desires. The part that represented his humanity was screaming at him furiously. You're really willing to sacrifice your own flesh and blood just to live a bit longer? Just to get off of this world? Is it really worth it? On one side was his daughter, and on the other was his longevity and his deep, insane desire to escape this prison he was in. Du Lingfei was currently in the middle of a struggle, and so was the Celestial. Daddy, please. Du Lingfei had begun to weep. She trembled physically as she fought against the slave seal. Every time she pushed against the magic of the seal, intense force slammed into her mind, making it feel like her soul might collapse at any moment. Daddy, is it worth it? I'm your daughter. I beg you, Daddy. I beg you. And yet, she wouldn't give up. She didn't want to hurt Bai Xiaochun, and also didn't want to see her father like this. In her pain, she was like a helpless child who could do nothing more than beg and plead. The father she remembered was not like this. Worse, she couldn't remember when he had changed. When had he become a stranger, a person who would actually hurt her? Upon parting with Bai Xiaochun in the north, she had returned to Heavenspan Island. Gradually, she came to find that her mind was slowing down, and eventually, she heard a complex, emotional howl from the palace of the Tao. It was her father, the Celestial. That was when she lost control of her own body. And yet, she never lost her consciousness. Eventually, she watched herself consuming Bai Xiaochun's life force, and watched him dying, and the pain became too much to bear. Daddy, she said, trembling as the slave seal began to slowly collapse as she fought back against it. However, it was at this point that the Celestial looked up, his eyes burning with madness. Shut up. Shut the hell up. As his shout echoed out like thunder, the madness in his eyes grew even more intense, and all the warmth of humanity that existed inside of him was wiped away. He shoved his memories of Du Lingfei away as surely as if he had cut them with a blade. He was no longer Du Lingfei's father. He was the Celestial, someone who didn't care about anything other than his longevity and his hopes for the future. Fuse with Bai Xiaochun. That is your mission. Combine the undying with that which can live forever. That is the entire purpose of your existence. Face twisting with vicious coldness, he waved his finger out in front of him. The slave seals in Du Lingfei's eyes glowed so brightly they turned red. It was as if her mind was being suppressed, and as she lost control, she slowly reached back out toward the top of Bai Xiaochun's head. As her hand neared, it trembled, and Du Lingfei's eyes twitched. Despite how furiously the slave seals were controlling her, she was still trying to resist. Crystalline light shone brightly as she murmured, I won't. Tears streamed down her face and fell onto Bai Xiaochun. Blue veins bulged out on her face from the effort of speaking, and bloody wounds could be seen as her skin ripped and tore from the effort of fighting against the slave seals. She looked like she was about to collapse both physically and in terms of her divine sense. And yet, she wouldn't stop fighting. As of this moment, it was possible to see Du Lingfei's unswerving determination. She had made her decision. She would rather destroy herself than betray what she believed in. Bai Xiaochun could barely see what was happening. Virtually all of his life force was gone, and his mind was in chaos. His lips parted to speak, and yet, he didn't even have the energy to say a single word. The tears falling onto his parched skin created rippling waves in his heart. When the Celestial saw that Du Lingfei was about to destroy herself, his anger flared. "Unfilial bitch," he shouted, striding forward into the black pool of liquid. The black liquid began to swirl about even faster, and the magical symbols all shied away from the Celestial. Ignoring them, he stepped up to Du Lingfei and put his left hand onto her head, and then placed his right hand onto Bai Xiaochun's. Tightening his fingers, he pushed both of their heads toward each other. "You know, according to my original plan, after I refined you into an undying live forever pill and left this prison of a world, I would eventually become an Archean and then figure out a way to resurrect you. Why must you rebel against me? Why? Why do you go so far as to defy me?" The Celestial's twisted expression was terrifying. He radiated a sensation of complete madness. As for Du Lingfei, she tried to fight back, but was powerless to do so. With the Celestial forcing her head toward Bai Xiaochun's, there was nothing she could do, not even kill herself. As the Celestial forced Du Lingfei and Bai Xiaochun closer to each other, the radiant golden and crystalline lights began to swirl together with glittering radiance. "All I wanted you to do was consume Bai Xiaochun," the Celestial raged. "All I asked you to do was become an undying live forever pill. If I had any other choice, I wouldn't do this." Apparently, it was only by shouting at the top of his lungs that the Celestial could convince himself that what he was saying made sense. "I can't simply gamble that the world gate can be opened after the Gravekeeper dies. What if it's sealed for all eternity? At that point, it wouldn't matter if I got the technique. Therefore, I have no choice but to refine you two into a pill now. Then, I can finally acquire the undying live forever technique, and be unstoppable. I can't bet on what I don't know. If the world ends up sealed, I'll never be able to change it. I have no choice here. If you were in my position, you would do the same thing. With that pill, I will no longer be a quasi-celestial. I will be a true celestial. I will conform to the requirements of the will of this world, and will be able to leave. Why are you defying me? You're just like your eldest sister. She defied me too. Why? She did it for the blood ancestor, and you for Bai Xiaochun? Why? All I have to do is get out of here and become an Archean. Then I can resurrect you. How can the two of you be so selfish?" The Celestial was screaming so loudly that in the outside world, wild colors flashed in the sky, and raging winds screamed across the heaven-span sea, causing huge waves to rise up. In the depths of the Palace of the Tao, the Celestial's energy radiated out, provoked by his emotions. The spell formation was reaching its pinnacle of power, and as the black liquid in the pool spun faster and faster, the bones in the necropolis melted, and began to fuse with Bai Xiaochun and Du Lingfei. Apparently, the spell formation was now acting like an enormous pill furnace, refining the ingredients therein to create an undying live forever pill. This was the most intense moment of deadly crisis Bai Xiaochun had ever experienced during his entire life. There was nothing he could do to stop what was happening. He didn't even have the strength to struggle. With the Celestial having physically taken matters into his own hands, it seemed a foregone conclusion how things would end up. Bai Xiaochun's path of cultivation would end with Du Lingfei, the two of them refined into a medicinal pill by this enormous spell formation, which the Celestial would then use to transcend the bounds of the world in which he lived. Never could he have imagined that things would end up like this, not even after having been told by the frigid matriarch that he would eventually have a falling out with the Celestial. Bai Xiaochun had always naively believed that because of Du Lingfei, the Celestial wouldn't do anything too harmful to him. Furthermore, he had the Gravekeeper and Bai Hao on his side, and a vast array of secret weapons that had filled him with confidence. Except, all of that had been as realistic as the reflection of the moon on a shimmering lake. He was losing consciousness, yet strangely, Du Lingfei's aura also gave him a strange sense of clarity. "What if all of this is part of the Gravekeeper's plan?" he murmured. Seemingly in concert with Bai Xiaochun's speculation, the Gravekeeper, who sat cross-legged in the pagoda in the ruins of the third level of the subterranean Arch-Emperor city, opened his turbid eyes. "Bai Xiaochun," he murmured bitterly, "I hope that you won't hate me. This is my mission, and the mission of the Hell Emperor." His gaze penetrated the void, passing to the ends of the wildlands, to a huge river that no one could see. There in the inky, endlessly flowing darkness was the antithesis of all of the life force of the heaven-span sea. This river represented death. Its waters were filled with infinite vengeful souls, all of them howling and screaming as they were carried along by the river water into the cycle of reincarnation. Its name, the Underworld River. At the furthest end of the Underworld River was a pitch-black palace, rife with an aura of death. It was cold beyond belief, without even the slightest hint of a flame anywhere. It was the Underworld Palace. Sitting inside of the palace, clad in imperial robes, was the reigning Hell Emperor, Bai Xiao. Radiating off of him was an intense aura of death. He normally wore a stern expression, but now, his face was a mask of anxiety. His mood affected the Underworld Palace and the Underworld River, causing waves to spread out across its surface. He had personally witnessed the Celestial's enormous hand defeat the Gravekeeper, as well as his own attempt to interfere. He had watched helplessly as the sinister Celestial took Bai Xiaochun away, and although he couldn't be sure of all the details, he was convinced that his master was in critical danger. And he knew that the only person in the world who could save his master was himself. He well knew how weak the Gravekeeper was, and that he could pass away into death at any moment. Sadly, Bai Xiao also knew that, despite being the Hell Emperor, he was currently not a match for the Celestial. Master, he murmured bitterly. Many memories floated up in his mind, memories of the time he had spent with his master in the wildlands. Bai Xiaochun was his only family, and there was no one who Bai Xiao felt more gratitude to than him. He had even sworn an oath to protect him with his own life. His days spent with his master were the happiest he had ever experienced. The memories faded away, leaving behind a single image, an image that would always be a part of his soul. It was an image of Bai Xiaochun standing there with his back to him, calmly accepting him as an apprentice. Master, Bai Xiao murmured, smiling. It was a smile filled with staunch determination. He knew that if he wanted to go to Heavenspan Island and take his master away from the Celestial, then there was only one way to do it. And that was to concoct something that could break through the limitations of the world itself. 22-colored flame. It hadn't mattered to Bai Xiao that Bai Xiaochun was already a diva. He had continued his auguries and research into 22-colored flame. Eventually, he had come to the realization that in this world, the limit for flame conjuring was 21-colored flame. With the exception of some special circumstances, it would be impossible to succeed with 22-colored flame. According to the limitations of the world, everything from 21-colored flame and below was considered mortal fire. However, everything from 22-colored flame onward was immortal fire. There could be nothing more powerful in this world than a 22-colored flame, if it appeared. In fact, it could burn anything that existed. Fire like that could be used to fight the Celestial, and could enable Bai Xiao to rescue Bai Xiaochun. Unfortunately, there were no souls within this world that could be used to concoct a 22-colored flame. Even using all of the souls within the Underworld River would yield nothing more than the limit of 21. There's only one way, he thought, shivering with fear. After a moment, though, the determination in his eyes grew stronger. It was a method Bai Xiao had come to understand due to two reasons. The first was that Miao Linner's clan had attempted to use him to conjure a flame. The second was that he was now the Hell Emperor. That method was to use his own soul to conjure that most consummate of flames, a 22-colored flame. That was the only way. And since Bai Xiao was the Hell Emperor and had complete control of the Underworld River, that meant that he controlled all of the souls that were part of the cycle of reincarnation. Master, I can save you. As he smiled, tears streamed down his cheeks, but his decision had been made. The price to pay was enormous, but he could accept it, without any regrets. Soon, Bai Xiao would cease to exist. And yet, he had no complaints. Bai Xiaochun was his master. In the moment that he had kowtowed to become an apprentice, he had decided that he would do anything to pay back that kindness. His tears were not corporeal. As they fell from his face, they became a part of the Underworld River. Sighing, he rose to his feet, then threw his hands wide. Souls, come to me. The endless torrent of vengeful souls outside of the Underworld Palace surged and began to head in his direction, forming a massive vortex. Bai Xiao performed an incantation gesture with his left hand, then touched his forehead, which caused his entire body to burst into flames. It was a one-colored flame. His hands began to blur with incantation gestures as the surrounding sea of souls spun and spun. One soul after another entered Bai Xiao, causing the flames that surrounded him to flicker in astonishing fashion. 2-colored flame, 3-colored flame, 4-colored flame. In only a few breaths worth of time, the sea of fire surrounding Bai Xiao reached epic proportions. It was soon featured 16 colors. And things kept going. If there was anyone in the entire world who could surpass Bai Xiaochun when it came to conjuring flames, Then that person was his apprentice, the Hell Emperor Bai Hao. Rumbling sounds continued to echo out as the flames burned around Bai Hao. Countless souls dove madly into him as a 17th color appeared, then an 18th and a 19th. Things weren't over yet. The determination in Bai Hao's eyes couldn't have been more intense. Waving both arms out in front of him, he caused the entire underworld river to shudder from beginning to end. 20 colors. 21 colors. At that point, Bai Hao looked out into the void and unleashed an incredible howl. At that point, his soul began to burn. With that power, along with the souls from the underworld river, and with the river itself as the base, Bai Hao's eyes slowly lit up with 21 colors. And then, another color appeared. It was a 22-colored flame. Nothing happened out in the wildlands when the 22-colored flame appeared. Everything seemed normal. The cultivators continued to fight, and yet, their hearts suddenly quivered. It was as if their souls were trembling due to the imminent arrival of some powerful, invisible force. Nascent soul cultivators, devas, even the demigods, all of them were so shaken that they gasped. It wasn't just in the wildlands that such things happened. All living beings in the lands of Heavenspan, from cultivators to animals, even the vegetation and the mortals, all reacted similarly. Then, high in the sky appeared the world net. At that point, all beings in the world heard a voice. Although it was only a murmur, the pressure weighing down on them was impossible to even describe. Master, I'm coming to save you. It was a voice filled with the deepest faith. It was a voice filled with fearless madness. It was a voice that revealed a deep reverence for a master, the type that could not be erased even by the destruction of the body. Heaven and earth rumbled as flames spread out across the sky of the wildlands. Cultivators from both sides of the conflict looked up in utter shock, with many of them gasping aloud. The sky is on fire? The heavens are aflame. How could this be happening? Look, there's a person inside that fire. The enormous figure which appeared inside of the flame slowly looked up, fixing his gaze on the distant heaven-span sea. As he did, his features became clear to the cultivators down below in the wildlands. Soon, the savages, soul cultivators, heavenly marquises and heavenly dukes began to cry out in astonishment. That's the Hell Emperor. The Hell Emperor. As everyone in the wildlands reeled in shock, Bai Hao began to speed toward the heaven-span sea with mountain toppling, sea-draining energy radiating around him in the form of the sky-wide sea of fire. The fire was spectacular to an indescribable degree, to the point where anyone who looked at it would assume that it could burn the entire world to a crisp. As for the heaven-span sea, the incoming fire instantly whipped it up into a frenzy, as though it wished to block its path. However, any such efforts were useless. The fire closed in from the direction of the wildlands, covering the entire sky above the heaven-span sea. The flames, which contained Bai Hao's will, then began to rush toward Heavenspan Island. The sea didn't seem capable of standing up to the burning heat of the fire, and began to evaporate, releasing boundless energy of heaven and earth. It was so unprecedentedly strong that it quickly spread out into the entire world, reaching even as far as the wildlands. Plants suddenly sprouted, and flowers bloomed. Animals roared, and all living things were deeply shaken. However, they also felt instinctively uneasy. After all, these levels of spiritual energy were clearly not a natural occurrence. They were more like when a cultivator burned his or her own soul to gain dangerous levels of power. The heavenspan sea was not without end, and as it evaporated and poured incredible spiritual energy out into the world, it did so in a way that couldn't be replenished. And yet, Bai Hao didn't care about that. He had surpassed the limits of the world by creating 22-colored flame, and had even placed his own soul on the road to sacrifice to do it. And there was only one reason for all of that. Bai Hao knew that he didn't have much time to work with. Just like the evaporation of the heavenspan sea, using his own soul to conjure 22-colored flame was a path that could not be returned from. Now that his soul was aflame, it would only be a short period of time before it was burned into nothing. At that point, the 22-colored flame would vanish. Time was of the essence, and therefore, Bai Hao immediately made his move on Heavenspan Island. If this moment were frozen in time and depicted artistically, the sky would not be visible, nor would the heavenspan sea. The only thing visible would be an endless sea of fire, descending with ultimate madness onto Heavenspan Island. As of this moment, Heavenspan Island did not exist within the Heavenspan Sea. Instead, it existed within heavenly flame. Its beaches melted, its lands were scorched black, and crevices ripped open everywhere. A roar like that of a furious giant echoed out in all directions as the fire completely engulfed the entire island. Many parts of the island began to explode, sending rock and rubble flying about, which was almost instantly transformed into ash. It was as if Bai Hao's plan to save Bai Xiaochun was to simply burn Heavenspan Island completely away. Rumbling sounds filled the world as the sea of fire became a huge mouth which consumed Heavenspan Island. The plants on the island vanished. Mountains turned bright red and then shattered, the resulting debris instantly becoming ash. There was little need to mention the beautiful buildings which filled the island. They were burned away within moments. The valuable medicinal plants that had once grown in abundance were destroyed, as was the lake of Heavenspan seawater and the waterfall. Thankfully, Bai Hao was by nature a kind person, and controlled the fire in a way that spared the special guards, who fled in complete astonishment. Someone's attacking Heavenspan Island. There were 2 old men among the special guards who were actually demigods. They were none other than the famed Heavenspan Island divine guards. And yet even they were completely flabbergasted by this raging fire. They couldn't even approach the flames, and were forced to watch from a distance as the flames engulfed the island, and rushed specifically toward the huge statue of the Celestial, his palace of the Tao. The 2 mountains to either side turned bright red, and then exploded into ash. At the same time, the flames engulfed the statue of the Celestial. Everyone watching could see it melt. Within a few breaths of time, the statue which had stood for so many years was reduced to a lump of slag, which then dissolved into ash. The entire palace of the Tao was wiped out of existence. The moment the Arch-Emperor dynasty had been driven out of the lands of Heavenspan, this island had become a holy land. But now, fire rained down from the heavens and wiped it out of existence. On what was left of the island, many of the flames converged together, revealing an enormous flame giant, radiating an aura that caused the entire world to tremble. The giant wore imperial robes made of flame, and a fiery imperial crown. When he spoke, it was in a roar that caused everything in the area to shake violently. "Master, I'm here to save you." The special guards were struck to the core, and their minds began to spin out of control. And yet, the burning destruction wasn't over yet. As the giant roared, the rest of the sea of fire, having destroyed everything on the surface of the island, began to pour into the crevices which had opened up in it. Their destination was none other than the huge spell formation in the necropolis. The spell formation was in full operation at the moment. The bones and the remains of the 3 arch-emperors had fully melted, and were now part of the spell formation. Roughly half of the black liquid was gone, having turned into countless magical symbols that crawled over Bai Xiaochun and Du Lingfei. As for the Celestial, he stood there, a vicious expression on his face as he kept his hands locked onto the heads of Bai Xiaochun and Du Lingfei. Fuse, 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 damn it. Bai Xiaochun and Du Lingfei were trembling non-stop, and seemed just on the verge of fusing together. And that was when the necropolis began to split apart. It was as if doomsday had arrived. The rock walls began to glow red, and then simply exploded, allowing torrents of fire to burst inside. It was as if the world were descending into a fiery apocalypse. Thus, this episode comes to an end. Remember to like and comment so we can discuss the story together. Until we meet again in the next chapters.